Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be with you all today for this really important conversation, and it is especially fabulous to be with you, Heidi and Charlie, for this conversation. We have been having this conversation. I've had this conversation with each of you over the years, but never together. Yeah. And so this is fantastic because you're both carrying so much wisdom about insurance coverage, and I know that this conversation is going to be really valuable for this audience, and it's going to be a fun conversation. We're not stuffy insurance people, we're fun insurance people, so we're going to have a great time. And the first thing that we wanted to do is give you guys just a little bit of foundational information about the landscape, the payer landscape and the healthcare delivery landscape that will give you something to work from. We have these things in our heads, but we think that this is just essential information to get started. So first of all, whenever you're having a conversation about like policy, especially around psychedelics, you want to know which access wedge you're in. Are you talking about religious use? Are you talking about legalization or decrim, like what's happening at the state level, or you talk about medicalization? So this conversation is squarely in the medicalization access wedge. Now, when we look at the payer landscape, this is what we see. You can see a little over half are what are considered commercial plans. These are largely employer-sponsored plans. The self-funded groups are wealthy companies that are paying cash for their medical claims, the Googles of the world, and they pay the large carriers to administer those benefits for them. Now, the fully insured plans, which also includes the individual plans, those are the ones that the health insurance carriers, the insurance companies, they carry risk for those themselves. And so you can affect those by getting the carriers to cover them. You can also affect those legislatively at the state level. On the government side, of course, you have Medicare, Medicaid, VA, and TRICARE, and they have their own decision-making processes. So this looks pretty manageable, right? Like, we can do this. Well, when you look a little bit closer, it actually looks like this. And what you're seeing here are individual, each of these wedges are individual buckets of people who are covered by different policies, different decision makers, different motivations, different buckets of money. And each of these wedges is often working with different information when they're making coverage decisions. So they don't, and the real kicker is they don't actually share information very well with one another. So this is actually a substantial task that we have in front of us, and why these conversations are so important. And Charlie, you wanted to mention something about this.
If you can you go back one slide?
Could we go back one slide?
Yes. So just one comment on the self-funded and fully insured on the commercial side. So we're in the commercial insurance world. Leah did a great job of explaining self-funded, which is the companies bear the medical risk for the costs of the claims, and the insurance company manages the benefit. The fully insured, the insurance company bears the risk for medical expenses and manages the claims. Now, most large carriers, the vast majority of covered lives in the commercial book of business are in the self-funded accounts. So most large Uniteds, Elevances, Aetnas of the world, their commercial book of business is mostly the management of the benefit and not managing they're not responsible for the medical costs. The vast majority of the revenue for the commercial carriers, so for an Elevance or a United, in the commercial book of business, back to that fragmented pie you saw, the vast majority of the revenues for a United or an Elevance on their commercial book of business are generated by the fully insured book. So, for example, when I was at Elevance, I need to mention I'm retired from Elevance/Anthem, but when I was there on our commercial covered lives, we probably had 12 or 13 million self-funded and 4 to 6 million of fully insured. And the revenue was almost the reverse of that, where most of the revenue came from our fully insured. So that's an important consideration, as we'll talk further this afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie. That really is an important consideration, and that'll become apparent as we talk about how coverage decisions are made. So we wanted to offer you, just a quick understanding of the healthcare delivery system. So you can think of these as separate channels or pillars or silos of the healthcare delivery system. So each of these have practitioners who have specific types of training and licensure, different types of services that are rendered in these different channels of care. And sometimes they intersect, right, and they work well. Pharmacy and medical work frequently very closely together, but often they are quite siloed, right? So there's not, the information sharing across these things can be a little bit challenging. And inside of the commercial health insurance companies, each of these represents an entirely separate division of the company with different decision makers, and that goes all the way up. So when you have therapies that would include, let's say, behavioral health and pharmacy, you have a bunch of different decision makers with different motivations and so forth who have to make those decisions together. So it adds to the complexity. Okay, so because we know that you remembered most of that, but you might forget a couple of things. Here's a QR code, and you can use this to go to a landing page. It has all the slides that we presented, plus the resources that are referenced or likely going to be referenced during our talk today. Let's give folks a minute to take that. Great. Okay. So, Heidi and Charlie, discussion about insurance coverage at its core is a discussion about health equity, right? Who is going to have access to these transformative therapies under what conditions, right? So it's not just about if it's covered, when, who, how, all of those play into this question of who has access. And this is an incredibly important conversation, right? And none of us have a crystal ball when it comes to psychedelic therapies. So I just want to do some level setting, that we're going to have a conversation here, but we don't know. And there is no one who knows exactly how this is going to roll out. It could roll out in a lot of different ways. So what we've decided is that the best thing to do is talk about how coverage decisions are typically made. And then let's look at what's different about psychedelic therapies and kind of some things that we might be able to anticipate with what we see so far, such as with the new CPT codes and so forth. So Charlie, we're gonna start with you, please. If you could just illuminate inside of the black box for us of commercial health insurance, how are coverage decisions for pharmacy and new therapies typically covered? What's a normal process?
Great question, and I'm looking out at this postprandial crowd here, and I can see the glucose levels are plummeting. We're just in the crash, so I want to do something a little different. So I'm going to ask for everybody who has, and I'm going to talk about Elevance, because that's what I'm most familiar with. There are parallels with other insurers, and I could talk to you about those offline. Who has heard of Elevance? I'm going to ask you to stand up. I know this. If you've heard of Elevance or Anthem, let me say Anthem, stand up. Okay. Some people raise their hand. They're really crashing. Okay. No, remain standing. This is interesting. So it's only 2/3 of the audience. Okay. Those who have heard of Carillon, remain standing. If you haven't heard of Carillon, sit down. Wow. Did you guys see what just happened? We have maybe 12 people left standing. Those of you remaining standing who can explain who can explain the connection between Anthem and Carillon, sit down. Guess what happens to me? No, I'm not going to say. You can explain it? The people standing? I'm going to call on you. Better be careful. Who can explain? You think that's right. Who can explain how behavioral health within Carillon is managed, both commercially and for Medicaid and for Medicare? So you have to sit down. That's it. I only bring that up for two reasons. One, it's interesting to see that 2/3 of you knew about the health insurer. but less than, I don't know, 10 people, 12 people knew what Carillon is. Carillon is critically important as you think about how we're going to get this reimbursed. How many people, show of hands, I won't ask you this, have heard of Optum? Everybody's heard of Optum. Carillon is Elevance's Optum, okay? How many people have heard of Evernorth? Much fewer. So Evernorth is, I got to get this right, Evernorth is Cigna. Thank you. Thank you. My point is, there really is no such thing as an insurance company, right? There are multiple versions of insurance companies depending on a whole bunch of different things. I think it was that famous health insurance exec, D.W. Winnicott, who said there's no such thing as a baby. You guys know him?
Yeah.
Yay for Winnicott. Okay, maybe not. Anyway, he was a famous pediatrician, psychoanalyst who said there really isn't a baby, there's a baby, and he was writing in the late 40s, a baby and a mother, or a baby and a caregiving system. And he said you can't just look at a baby in isolation. So you can't look at an insurance company in isolation. It's about the product, and that makes all the difference in terms of how you're going to get things covered. The companies all differ by line of business. So there's a segment in Elevance for commercial, there's a segment for Medicaid, there's a segment for Medicare. Each of them has a P&L owner, a profit and loss owner, right, who is ultimately responsible for the profitability of that group. Carillon, and Optum as well, and Evernorth as well, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the respective insurance companies, who manages the behavioral health benefit for the company. So in essence, the health insurer, Elevance, contracts with Carillon, the subsidiary, to manage the behavioral health business. So when Leah showed you that slide before with pharmacy and wellness and behavioral health and medical, most of those functions are contracted out to Carillon, who then has a suite of companies that provides those with certain exemptions. So when you're talking to care managers at a United or an Elevance, you're really talking to a Carillon or an Optum. And those are the ones who are also making both coverage decisions and benefit decisions. And most importantly, pharmacy at Elevance is managed as a wholly owned division within Carillon. So the pharmacy decisions, what gets on and off the formulary, is a Carillon decision. And I think the same is true at Optum, although I'm not 100% sure. So you need to, as you think about coverage decisions, be thinking about who do I need to talk to within what I previously thought of as a United or I previously thought of as an Elevance, but you need to find the line of business and who's responsible for what within that line of business. I think your prompt to me was, what are the standard processes by which decisions are made, benefit coverage determinations? That's a long-winded answer to get to. There are no standard processes because it all depends on the book of business that you're talking about. Maybe I'll stop there. Is that it? I could go, but
yeah, great. You'll have another crack at it in
Okay.
just a second. Heidi, same question to you. Thank you so much, Charlie. That was illuminating. And Heidi, we're going to take it to you. Same question. What could you say would be a normal kind of standard process for new coverage decisions on the Medicare, Medicaid side?
Awesome. Well, I feel like I should lead you through calisthenics before. If he had you stand up, I really need to, because public health insurance is very, very complicated, and Leah already gave this caveat starting out, but I think it's worth saying. I consider myself an expert in the U.S. healthcare system, and specifically, I'm an expert on the Medicaid program, but you don't have to go very deep before I'm confused, right? It's so complicated, and there's so many unknowns of the way that this is going to roll out that I feel like what I'm offering today is expert guessing. And I hope it's only slightly better than non-expert guessing. It's really, you could probably do a regression to see, how much more accurate we turn out to be than, a monkey. But, I don't know. Okay, so Medicaid is America's health insurance for low-income people. And it's a partnership between the federal government and states. So both of them put money into the program. And that means that they both have a lot of say about what is offered through the program. One important consideration is that all Medicaid programs, except for one state, has a constitutional requirement that they balance their budget every year. So the Medicaid program is a huge part of every state's budget, and it competes with things like education and roads and libraries and child protective services and everything else the state does. So anytime you have innovations that come into Medicaid that are going to raise costs, you have trade-offs that the state has to make. The federal government doesn't have that same constraint. They can go into deficit spending, which they often do, but the Medicaid programs cannot. So that's a real pressure point to think about when you think about psychedelics coming into Medicaid. They have a highly vulnerable population with a high burden of mental health disease, and they have a lot of people who would be eligible for these therapies. And if they're very expensive, the Medicaid program is going to want to look at them carefully. However, this is true of both Medicare and Medicaid. There's federal statutes that say what kind of treatments can be carved out and which kind cannot. And mental health is a protected category. So there's a lot of, many of you have been probably following the weight loss drugs. Medicare has a carve-out for weight loss drugs. So the Medicare program has not been covering any of the GLP-1 drugs. But this isn't the case with mental health. So basically, if an efficacious treatment gets past the FDA, there is kind of an obligation, I think, for both the Medicare and the Medicaid program to pay for it. But sticking with Medicaid for a moment, there's going to be a lot of challenges for implementing that, and there's places in the implementation where access breaks down. And I think that one of my concerns for the Medicaid program is that you could end up having coverage without care. And we're going to go into some of those challenges that they face over time. But basically, when new innovations come out in Medicaid, in mental health, there is, I think, an assumption that they will pay for it. Now, Medicare is a federally run program, and it's a federally financed program. And so they don't have the budget considerations. They do have solvency, which you hear about a lot in the media, like the Medicare program has to stay solvent for people who are aging into it in the future. But it's a big program, it's a well-funded program. And they have a commission, the Medicare Payment and Access Commission, or MedPAC, that makes a lot of coverage decisions for them. I think that when new treatments come out that haven't been well studied for the Medicare population, they have a lever that they can engage, which allows them to say, we're not going to cover this until there is more evidence that it benefits people age 65 and older or people with work-limiting conditions. So I think that in the case of psychedelics, it very well could hit a trigger, particularly MDMA, which skewed young in the clinical trials. I think that there's very much the possibility that they could use their federal decision-making power and say, we would like to see more research with older people before we cover this. So they would cover it under the condition of research. So it's a limited coverage. Whereas Medicaid will probably, if whoever the manufacturer, Lykos, USONA, whoever is working with the molecule, if they participate in the Medicaid drug rebate program, Medicaid doesn't actually have that same lever. They can't say we're not going to cover it. So they're going to engage other tools to try to protect the costs that it might have on the program.
Great. Well, thank you,
Let me
Heidi.
just pick up on that. On the commercial side, and Heidi, your comment just reminded me of this or resonated with me. MPAC, was that the name of the Medicare?
There's MedPAC for Medicare and MACPAC, which I'm a commissioner on for Medicaid.
Okay, so I think it's MPAC for Medicare. In the commercial world, roughly the equivalent of that are the pharmacy and therapeutic committee of the respective insurance companies. So they make decisions about what goes on the formulary based on the evidence and also new therapeutics. So kind of one takeaway for all of you as you're considering your interface and the industry as it's considering its interface to get these covered from a commercial perspective is to understand more deeply the P&T committee structure at respective health insurers, and in terms of that long sales cycle, you need 18 to 24 months to figure out who's on those committees, how can you engage with them, how can you educate them. I know there were some great comments, I think, by Graham and Bennett this morning about free education courses. I think it would be great if the industry could say, we're going to make a focused, concerted effort to educate the health insurance industry about, and I know efforts are underway, I don't want, but a focused effort to educate key decision makers on P&T committees about this interface. And I think it was Bennett's point, don't talk to the same people you usually talk to, because you're preaching to the choir, basically, in many instances. You need to get outside your focus, maybe, and think about broader folks within the payer commercial structure.
Great, thank you both. I'm just going to make a quick comment, and then we're going to move into coverage for PAT. So in terms of market conditions that can accelerate coverage adoption across different decision makers, carriers, government bodies, on the commercial side, you do see market effects where if one carrier or certain companies start to cover a certain benefit, that starts to set up a market condition where that's going to be desirable. And so if you get United, for example, covering it, the other carriers will look at it. If you get Google looking at covering something, then Apple's going to look at it too. Those kinds of effects are very real and can work to the benefit of something being covered. And then my understanding from learning from you, Heidi, is that there is a similar effect with Medicaid programs where they can actually learn from one another. So if coverage happens in one state, there are committee processes and so forth for some states where other Medicare programs can learn how to implement that coverage in another state. So there's some good things that can actually happen across these different decision makers and programs. And we would love to see that happen, of course, for psychedelic-assisted therapy. However, there's some real challenges. And so I'd love to hear, Heidi, I'm going to throw this back to you first. From a payer perspective, a government payer perspective, what are some of the things that are different about psychedelic-assisted therapy and some of the things that they would be taking into consideration with coverage?
Well, I think that one consideration is the vulnerability of the population they serve. So there will probably be concerns making sure that it's an efficacious, safe treatment. I think that, the other, big elephant, that I mentioned before is that if it's expensive, it's going to have a budgetary impact. And so I think that, states, because they have to cover mental health benefits, because they don't have as much picking and choosing as maybe, the private market. They will have to engage tools like utilization review, medical necessity requirements, prior auth, failure of other treatments in order to coverage cost, or, basically to stay budget neutral. I think one of the other big challenges that they have is that you can't force mental health providers into your network. They have to want to work with you. And particularly the Medicaid program is budget constrained. And so they're the lowest payer often when you compare them to Medicare or private insurance. And so I think a big challenge that they will have are finding qualified psychedelic practitioners who contract with them in order to provide these services. So that's what I mean by coverage without care. It can be a covered benefit, but if you can't find anybody, if no clinics are participating in the Medicaid program, if no individual practitioners are enrolled in Medicaid managed care plans, then, and there's something that insurance companies use called network adequacy. And that means that you have to demonstrate that you have providers to treat the needs of your population, but it's not disaggregated by types of coverage or types of providers. So for example, network adequacy for mental health will be divided by adult providers, pediatric providers, the number of providers in a geographic area. It's not the number of psychedelic-assisted therapy practitioners in a general area. That's not how they, so you could demonstrate that you have network adequacy for mental health and not have any psychedelic-assisted therapy practitioners in your network. And so, states are going to have to be, in the Medicaid program, states are going to have to be convinced that this is really important for their population, and that they will have to do the work engaging with managed care organizations to identify providers and get them in network. Yeah. Otherwise, again, it'll be covered, but when you try to find somebody who will provide it for you, there won't be anybody to do it.
So Heidi, this is a really important point, and Charlie, I want to follow up with you. So what Heidi is talking about is when Medicaid has this coverage without care. So yes, it's covered, but we don't actually have anybody in the Medicaid network or Medicare network to provide the service. Now, Charlie, is that the same on the commercial side? Can you have that dynamic where there's coverage without actually access to care?
That's my old friend Henry here. Can you hear me? My microphone's been... Yes? We're good? Okay. Yes, it's a challenge. I mean, the phrase for it is ghost networks, where you have a directory full of providers, either who are no longer taking patients or are selectively taking patients depending on the funding source and the adequacy of the funding. So the same applies certainly in the commercial space. And I think it begs the larger question that we'll chat about, which is who's going to credential the providers? Are providers going to ask for specialty credentialing? And then how are payers going to interface with that specialty credentialing system? I think it was interesting to note that I just saw a piece earlier this week, I think, where Compass is contracting with a New Jersey provider, Meridian Health, to explore how their treatment... Thank you.
Thank you. How their treatment of their compound for major depression will get delivered. So the notion that maybe, Compass and Meridian 3 years from now will be able to turn, for example, to a Horizons Blue Cross Blue Shield and say, we've got the compound, and oh, by the way, Horizons, you don't need to worry, we've got the delivery system, we've got credential certified providers that can deliver the care in a quality way that we're going to oversee, potentially would make the path towards an acceptance by a large payer that much easier. So I think that's going to be an interest, not that 3 years from now, that contract will still be in place, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, so a unified credential can streamline the pathway for networks to be built. And who is deciding what those credentials are, what the training standards are? I mean, that's a really important consideration for the field. I think that we'd be remiss, we're running low on time, so I am going to bring up this point. There is evidence, some evidence that with psychedelic-assisted therapy, culturally adequate care actually means culturally reflective care. So this is, of course, the work of Monica Williams and others in the field that indicate that it's possibly a clinical safety issue for a person of color or a different background, LGBTQ, to be able to have a practitioner who reflects their culture and their background in the room with them. And so I wonder how, if it turns out that it is actually a clinical safety issue, how this might play into the coverage decisions, if at all.
I mean, I don't think that coverage decisions work that way. I don't think that probably they've done the analysis to show that racial concordance or sexual orientation concordance or any of these. I mean, the evidence base just isn't there yet because the clinical trials have been so small. But I think that it is a very important conversation to be thinking. And this is an important conversation for the Medicaid program, too, because it's a diverse program. It's a minority-majority program. So it's really critical to be thinking about training a diverse workforce, which is why, I'm at the School of Social Work at Columbia University, and we're partnering with schools of nursing and other schools of social work to get social workers and nurses as prepared to go into this field because they are a more diverse population than psychiatrists or psychologists. And so there's a lot of, I think, what I've learned working in health policy over the years is there's so many levers to equity or inequity. There's levers at every step of the process. And so, one of the things anytime I get in front of an audience to really encourage us to do is to, instead of thinking about how to scale up, how do we have the most psychedelic-assisted therapy possible, scaling big, what if we change the question to how do we ensure that the people who need these treatments the most are the first in line to receive them? I found my people. If you ask that question, it changes the conversation every time. It really, it makes us start to think about, like, every time we enter a place where there's a lever for access, how do we prioritize and think about what that lever means in terms of access and equity? And I think the example of provider certification training is a really good one, because if you think of health policy as a three-legged stool where you have access, you have affordability, and you have quality, as you make adjustments in one area, you affect the other areas. So if we could go all out on quality, we could say that every practitioner needs like 150 hours of dedicated education in psychedelic-assisted therapy. They need to take an exam and be certified by a board. They need to participate in a professional association and go through, CEUs every year. Those are all really important quality measures. But when you invest that much money in your practice, you have to get it back somewhere, right? Like if you've taken a $15,000 training program and you pay a licensing fee and you have to charge more. And as you charge more, insurance companies will put more in place to try to decrease those costs. And it may determine who you're able to see and who you're not able to see. And then you have access go down. So we can't just, we have to be enthusiastic about quality, but we have to recognize that every time we add to the cost of affordability, we are probably decreasing access. And so not to throw any of those things out, but to recognize that we're constantly making those trade-offs and to make it in a very thoughtful, deliberate, strategic way.
Yeah, great. So just before we came on stage, actually we were having a conversation about the new CPT codes and how one of them actually allows for a non-licensed provider to be reimbursed by insurance. And why that's important to this conversation is because you can have people from more diverse backgrounds possibly entering the field who are then being overseen by nurses, by social workers, and so forth. So the way that those CPT codes are structured, the temporary code set at least, seems to be positive in terms of having a more diverse workforce and achieving some level of quality. I think the other piece around quality that we want to keep in mind too is about post-market surveillance. And this means the analysis that will be done as to what the outcomes are like, what the person's training was, who the provider's training and background, and kind of what the outcomes they're having. That'll play out over a number of years and could impact coverage decisions as that analysis is done. We have about 6 minutes left, and I'd love to jump to some audience questions. There are some very good ones here. This is the big one. If MDMA is legalized through the FDA, how long do you think it will take afterwards for major payers to cover it? No crystal balls, no predictions.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was thinking about this, obviously, for the past couple of days as I thought about this conference. I think it's going to take a while. It's not going to be instantaneous, but I don't think I think it could be a year. And let me explain a little bit of the reasoning behind that. Again, it has to go through the P&T committee. This commercial, we'll talk Medicare, Medicaid in just a moment, but I think you're going to need to go through the P&T committee. They're going to look at evidence. I chuckled. We'll talk about it later. I think I may be the only person in the world who still gets a paper newspaper, but this is the post from the end of April, front page, below the fold. FDA bid on ecstasy shows it's hard to test psychedelics. Okay, so this is this is the post. This is what everybody in Capitol Hill looks at. At least they look at the first page. I don't know if they actually read it, but that's out there, and the insurers are also seeing this kind of information. So the P&T committee is going to chew on this stuff, and the industry is going to need to respond in a thoughtful, deliberate way. I know already work is underway, but that's going to be that is going to take a bit of time. to move that through. And even once it's covered, there's no guarantee that then you're going to need to contract on an individual company level. There's no guarantee, and that's a process, right? And that's something that's going to take some time. One piece that I think is connected to that is, as an industry, it would make sense to get back to that self-insured versus fully insured division within the commercial book of business, where most of the revenue comes from fully insured, but the vast majority of the membership in a commercial insurer is from self-insured companies. Those companies potentially are some of your greatest allies in getting insurance companies to provide the coverage. So, your lobbying with them, I think, becomes a key piece of the strategy in terms of rapidly moving towards coverage within a commercial book for this, once FDA approval is granted.
Great, and because it relates, the recent ICER report that came out, Charlie, that was a little bit hard to hear, news that was a little bit hard to hear, and we wonder how do the payors, the commercial payors, use that kind of report in their decisions?
Well, it'll become part of the discussion in those P&T committees. And just, on the commercial side, arguably true also in Medicaid and Medicare for the private insurers, but let's just talk commercial. The decision makers are not the medical directors, right? If I said to you, if I could get you 5 minutes to do an elevator pitch to the chief executive officer of the company, the chief medical director for the entire company, the CFO of the company, or the president of the commercial division, who would you take your time with? We could argue about who it should be, but it certainly should not be the chief medical officer, because they're already convinced. You go out and talk to the chief medical officers, they've read the clinical literature, they've seen the papers, so they're already fully on board. You're going to have to impress the underwriters on the fully insured book of business, and you're going to have to impress the account management guys on the non-fully insured book of business, the ASO business. They need to feel like, gee, if I don't cover this, Verizon is going to leave Elevance, right? They need to, so that's a pressure point that I think you guys should think about. How do you leverage that?
Right.
On the public side, I think the pressure point are your elective representatives, and that includes state government, so the governor's office, the state legislature. I will say that in my real life, I live and breathe, Medicare and Medicaid policy, and I don't hear any conversations, like zero. I have not heard a peep. My world with psychedelics and my world with that have not intersected yet. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done to educate them. So I think that there will be kind of a delay as they kind of go, what, psychedelics? But they are public programs, and they are influenced by policymakers. And so making the case to people who then influence those public programs is actually super highly effective. One of the things that I'm curious about is how the adult supervised use models will impact insurance coverage, because it's interesting that you can go to Oregon and you can do a psilocybin session without a diagnosis, without a provider, without any intersection with the medical system. And if I were an insurer, I'd kind of be like, why would I pay for this? You can, you could go and get it outside. So I'm curious how they will see those efforts, because it's kind of, it's an example of where the public is ahead of the research and the policy, and they're pushing things faster than the processes by which they make their way through the FDA and into the healthcare system. But now you have this parallel path, and I'm really curious how the two will intersect or influence each other.
Great. Well, we just have a couple more seconds, and so I'm going to ask a last question. This is a yes or no.
Okay.
It's structured that way. You guys are going to answer how you're going to answer. So you personally, if you had a family member who needed MDMA or psilocybin-assisted therapy, would you personally send your family member to a provider who had not themselves consumed that substance?
There we have it. The audience has spoken.
Yes. I'm going to say, because I'm teaching students, and I cannot tell students that they need to use these substances. There's not a control, a legal way for them to do that. Yes, because not everybody can take these substances. It is counterindicated for a lot of people, and it would be dangerous for them to do that. And to say that they can't be an effective therapist, I don't think is true. Now, do I think that there's benefit from having your own experiences? Absolutely. But there's also harm if you've done so I think that it's just, my answer is yes, I would send a family member.
That wasn't a yes or no answer.
That was a yes answer.
I noticed.
The answer was yes.
I'm going to do the same. I would say I would send a family member to somebody who was well-trained and well-credentialed to provide care. Now, I say that, and I was thinking about this earlier when some of the earlier speakers, I'm probably in the vast majority of people in the room who hasn't taken a mind-altering substance at some point in my youth. I was the guy in the 70s when my friends were tripping, I was the guide. So I was that kind of guy, and then I went into mental health for obvious reasons. So I don't want to say... I don't want to say people shouldn't take it, but I think I agree with you. There are people who could be well-trained who don't necessarily have to have partaken. That's a middle. Is that a middle?
Yeah, that's a middle.
Okay.
And I think it's fair for, you guys are easy on me. You're not even making me answer the question. I think it's fair for me to answer the question. And my answer would be that if there was a choice, I would choose a professional who had themselves had the experience if there was a choice for my family members. I am so grateful to you both. I'm so grateful to this audience. Thank you all for your incredible listening and up and down and all the things you did. And we hope this was a great, helpful conversation for you. And thanks to everyone here for what you are doing for this movement.